Welcome to Asia Inside Out, the signature podcast of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Asia Inside Out brings together our team and special guests to take you behind the latest policy headlines and provide an insider's view on regional and global affairs. Each episode will deliver an interview with informed experts, analysts, and decision makers from across the Asia-Pacific region. If you want to dig into the details of the latest policy trends and why they're important, this is the podcast for you. Welcome to Asia Inside Out.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Farwa Aamer. I'm the Director of South Asia Initiatives at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Today, I am delighted to be in conversation with Anirudh Suri on India as the AI middle power and its quest for tech sovereignty. Anirudh is the author of The Great Tech Game and the host of its podcast. He is managing partner at India Internet Fund. He also serves as a scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he has previously worked with the Government of India in New Delhi, with McKinsey & Co. in New York, and other global institutions. Thank you, Anirudh, for joining me on the Asia Inside Out. We're recording on July 7, day one of the AI for Good Global Summit being held in Geneva. And as global stakeholders convene to discuss how to harness AI's potential to solve global challenges, it's a good opportunity for us to talk about India as a country that has been championing inclusive AI and has grand ambitions of becoming a tech powerhouse, albeit amid its own share of difficulties. So, Anirudh, let me just start with this. Much of the global conversation around AI is now framed in terms of sovereign AI, that countries should have greater control over the key layers of the AI stack. Can you briefly walk us through India's AI strategy and how it has evolved over the past years? And what does AI sovereignty mean for India today?
No, thanks so much, Farwa, and thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm excited about our conversation. So I think if you look at India's particular AI strategy, it's gone through, I would say, two phases in the past, and now I think it's in phase three. So phase one was really back in 2018 when India's primary government think tank, um, the Niti Aayog, came out with a national strategy for AI paper, right? Where if you went back and looked at that document, it is largely looking at AI as a technology that will help with problem solving in India's key social sectors: healthcare, agriculture, education, cities or urban infrastructure, etc. And it largely thought of AI as a technology that will help hopefully accelerate solutions in those sectors, right? And the key catchphrase in that document is hashtag AI for all. The idea being that it will largely be used for India's social sector and the broader population in these sectors, right? So, and then not much happens for a few years, I would say, until, of course, 2022-23, when largely due to ChatGPT and its very rapid rise in the mainstream discourse, in 2023, I would say the phase two begins, where India comes up with what is called the India AI mission, where you would now start to see the elements of India trying to build certain amount of competitiveness in the global AI ecosystem, as opposed to earlier where it was largely being seen as a technology to be used. And the India AI mission, I would say, is the representation of the evolution of India's AI strategy to go now into the AI ecosystem as a key player, as a key competitor. The India AI mission sees AI as an evolving landscape, but also sees AI as a stack, the technology as a stack, which is not what you saw in the Niti Aayog paper early on. And it says that, okay, we've got to build capabilities across the AI stack. There's some 7 elements to that, 7 pillars to that, including, of course, the chips or the infrastructure piece, but also includes data, R&D, startup or innovation, skilling, and other layers like that. And that's really, I would say, phase two, where India starts to build out certain foundations of that AI stack as part of a strategy to compete or at least be a player in the AI ecosystem. And then I would say now India is entering phase three, where, much to your question about sovereign AI, a lot of the thinking around AI is becoming, okay, what do we need to maintain some amount of strategic autonomy in adoption of AI, in competing in the AI ecosystem, and then also whatever layers of the AI stack we'll need for more sovereign functions like national security and others, right? So I would say now India has evolved onto stage three, where the thinking is now a lot more around sovereign AI. Now, to your question specifically about sovereign AI and how it's being conceptualized in India, um, I would say that sovereign AI has gotten confused as a concept around the world. And this is not just an India specific issue, but India, much like other countries, is seeing sovereign AI as an attempt to build everything on your own, to build chips and infrastructure on your own, to build data centers on your own, to build sovereign models on your own, to do R&D on your own, to build your own startups, etc., etc., etc. Right? Around the world, that's become the conception of sovereign AI. But for those who come from a political science background, will understand the distinction I'm going to try and make now, which is sovereign never meant in a political science context also that a country should become autarkic or that it should economically do everything on its own or stop trading or have strategic interdependence, right? So unfortunately, I think everyone around the world has started to confuse sovereign AI to mean autarkic AI or that you've got to build everything on your own. Whereas I think the slightly more nuanced conception of sovereign AI has to be that you build enough capabilities that you have sovereignty or autonomy in your decision making, that you're able to make decisions on your own of what technologies you will adopt, what technologies you will not adopt, which tech stack you'll be part of, which tech stack you'll not be part of, which models will be acceptable in a country, which will not, right? And what part of that AI stack will you compete in such that tomorrow there's a interdependent AI economy where much like an ASML has shown or a TSMC has shown that you don't need to compete in the entire stack. If you look at Netherlands or Taiwan, it's not that they are building their own sovereign models, but they've built key capabilities that allows them to build interdependence with other countries who might have capabilities in other parts of the stack, right? So I think this conception of a sovereign AI, I think, has yet to creep in India as well, but I'm hoping will creep in so that actually you build out a strategy for that kind of sovereign AI as opposed to an autarkic AI.
Thank you, Anirudh. And you mentioned the layers, the various components that go into the stack, into building the AI ecosystem. And we look at India, and it has vibrant democracy. It has got a vast population. It's got the domestic market. It offers the scale, but
Yeah.
a lot more goes into the AI ecosystem, which is less visible, which you spoke a little bit about, the cloud infrastructure, having compute, having energy, having sort of the right infrastructure, semiconductor base, all of that. When you look at these components, what do you see as India's sort of biggest structural bottleneck today? We've just come out of this crisis, the energy crisis, from the Iran war. And it has
Yeah.
laid bare vulnerabilities within the larger sort of Asian economy, the interdependencies that sort of withhold some of these countries and the ambitions that they have and how they can come to sort of inhibit economic growth. So when you put that in within the AI ambitions and becoming advanced technologically, how do you assess the vulnerabilities that could hold India back?
Yeah. So I think the mainstream understanding of India's structural bottlenecks is that India doesn't have its own sort of AI chips, right? Think NVIDIA. India doesn't have an NVIDIA type company building or designing chips at that level. India does not have a major fab like a TSMC within India. So the largest focus traditionally over the last year or two in terms of where bottlenecks for India have been in AI have focused on the infrastructure piece, right? But in my opinion, I think the structural bottlenecks for India lie elsewhere. Today, if you look at India's consumption of chips or energy for data centers that are powering, let's say, AI, models or AI use cases, it's still fairly low, right? India doesn't have OpenAI or Anthropic or a Google Gemini sitting or coming out of India or even a DeepSeek, that your requirements for chips or your requirements for energy would be that high for AI, right? Of course, India has, as a growing country, as a developing country, has massive energy needs, right? That's a whole separate conversation whether energy independence is something that India can achieve given the latest developments in the Middle East and what that sort of showcase in terms of vulnerabilities. But if we were to focus on AI, I don't think the structural bottlenecks for India lie on the chips or the energy side quite yet, because the usage of chips or data centers or energy for data centers is still fairly limited in India. I think where the structural bottlenecks for India to become an AI power lie are actually on three other pieces. And I've written a paper for Carnegie on this, which I call the missing pieces in India's AI puzzle, which are talent, data, and R&D, right? These three pieces actually people are not talking enough about, I would say, in India, in the AI context. But these are the real bottlenecks, I think, for India. Let me quickly explain why those three and what those three mean. Talent, India is, of course, considered a talent nation. India is you know, the pool of Indian IT and tech talent today is sitting everywhere around the world. The prime examples, of course, are Satya Nadella and Sundar Pichais of the world. But even in terms of the mid-level engineers around the world, many are of Indian origin, but they're largely sitting outside of India, right? So today, for India to really compete and win in AI, to do what China has tried to do with DeepSeek, right, or the other latest models that have come out of China, or to do something along the lines of what the US has done, or even if France is trying to do with Mistral, India needs top tier like AI research talent, right? So India has a whole, I would say, pool of software engineers, of course, but I think India needs more of the top tier research talent that seems to be driving the cutting edge research in AI in Silicon Valley or in China or elsewhere, right? So that's really a structural bottleneck for India. India needs more of that. India does have some domestically in our IITs and IICs and institutions like that, but it needs more, right? So that's one. Second, data, right? So largely now, if you hear the discourse around India as a source of data, India is one of the richest sources of data, right? Given that India's vast population, right, over 1.4 billion people, many of them are today on smartphones, digitally connected, doing payments through India's UPI and other platforms, other digital public infrastructure, also transacting on e-commerce platforms, quick commerce, taking cabs. So a lot of data being generated, but a lot of that data today doesn't reside or doesn't get accessed by Indian researchers, Indian firms, because the data is either owned by foreign firms or that data is lying in silos and not accessible to the researchers or the startups that could build on top. So that's a problem or a bottleneck to be solved for in India. That's number two. And the third is R&D, right, which is linked to the two. If you have the talent and you have the data, then actually you can build a very thriving, cutting edge R&D ecosystem in India when it comes to AI. But you need the first two pieces for that. So I think if India can solve for these three structural bottlenecks, then our needs for the cutting edge AI chips and our need for energy to power inference and training for our AI models will rise rapidly. And that's when they will also become possible constraints. But today, I would say the three structural bottlenecks are the three I've outlined.
Thank you, Anirudh, for identifying a bottleneck that we don't get to speak a lot more about, the R&D sort of upskilling, having the talent that is needed to really power some of these ambitions. But coming back to the global AI ecosystem, when we look at the bigger picture, power is concentrated between the United States and China, more or less. And we've seen that governments are increasingly willing to use technological access as a source of strategic leverage, especially in times of geopolitical competition, high geopolitical competition, including export controls and restrictions to latest frontier AI models, as we've seen what happened with Anthropic's latest models. So when we look at middle powers like India, where you talked about earlier, it's important to think of sovereignty from a different lens. It's about sovereignty in decision making. The idea of building a complete sort of technologically autonomous stack might not be sort of the right objective, but perhaps when we look at the examples of Netherlands or Taiwan, it's to build indispensability in a certain layer. So could India move forward with that goal in mind, whether on its own, harnessing its own experience with success in DPI, but also working with other middle powers?
Yeah, I think working with other middle powers is the way to go for India at this point, right? So to achieve the kind of strategic autonomy in AI, or the term sovereign AI that we just unpacked in the way I'm defining it, which is sovereignty in decision making, the ability to take your own decisions and not be locked in, right, where you don't have any choice. I think the one of the key pathways for India to achieve that has to be cooperation with other middle powers. And you're seeing that. I think India, France, India, Japan, India, Korea, of course, India, US, right? India, UK. There's a lot of attempts, I think, currently underway for India to cooperate with other middle powers and, of course, the US, possibly China as well, to maintain a set of options, a set of choices, right, across the AI stack. So when it comes to chips, you want to have choices. When it comes to the software that lies on top of those chips, you want to have choice. When it comes to the equipment you need to power your data centers, you need choice, etc., etc., etc. When it comes to models, you want choice, etc. Right? So to get choice, you've got to have a world where the sources of the AI stack cannot be just one or two, right? Because if it's only the US and China, then of course, sometimes geopolitically or for other reasons, certain options will not be on the table. Sometimes they might be denied to you, right? Like we've seen with Anthropic and Claude. Now, of course, that has been reversed, but I think it's not going to be a one-off thing. It'll most likely continue that kind of on and off access. So given that geopolitical scenario, the more middle powers like India, Japan, France, Singapore, and others can work together to build more options for models, more options for equipment for data centers, more options for R&D collaboration, right? More options for energy, right? This goes to your question. Again, diversification of your potential choke points has to be the strategy, and that's where middle powers have to cooperate, because India is not alone in this situation, right? France is facing a similar situation. Japan's facing a similar situation. When access to Anthropic's latest models gets cut off, it gets cut off not for India alone, but for every foreign country, right? So cooperation has to be one of the ways. That's one. At the same time, I think India is starting to, and I think this is correct, India is starting to build certain capabilities on its own also domestically, right? So that, because this is a long-term game, right, Farwa? So you've got to start building, identifying which parts of the AI stack you could possibly build some amount of competitive advantage in. So India is going through this exercise of where does India's competitive edge in that AI stack lie? I think data, talent, energy, all renewable energy, all of these are fair areas for India to try and build its competitive edge in over the next few years, so that its ability to have interdependency also goes up. So cooperation with middle powers, one. Second is to build certain amount of capabilities where you can build competitive edge in, you do that. And third is, I think, ultimately as a market, right? For India, India has massive scale as a market, as a consumer market, as an enterprise market, and it has to leverage that. So tomorrow, if any of the large AI companies want access to a growing market, tech savvy, digitally savvy, as you know, OpenAI and Anthropic, the second or third largest market will typically be India, Indian consumers, Indian enterprises. India has to leverage market access in return for certain things. And so I think that, again, will be, I think, the third pillar for India's effort to be sovereign in an AI world. And then finally, I think is use case and adoption, right? So which of course, if you listen to folks like Nandan Nilekani, etc. from India, they have for long advocated that India must focus on building India-specific use cases of AI in healthcare, in education, or any other part of the economy, where then innovation will come out of India as well in those areas, right? Because use cases will be very specific. You have the kind of scale that you can only get in India today, if not China. Um, and with the digital public infrastructure win that India has had over the last decade or so, you have really a population that can adopt AI at scale. And so when innovation starts to happen, then that can be taken to other parts of the global south and, of course, other parts of the developed world as well. And so then that becomes, I would say, the fourth pillar of India's sovereign AI strategy.
And thank you, Anirudh. You mentioned India, Japan. Let's focus on that a little bit because we're also meeting a couple of days after Prime Minister Takaichi's big New Delhi visit. One of the main focus areas of the discussion that happened at the India-Japan Annual Summit was AI. And both countries have committed to building a secure, trusted, inclusive AI ecosystem. Can you speak to us about that partnership? What would that look like? Because both countries have also committed to a joint vision for the next decade. There are real complementarities if you look at Japanese sort of specialized manufacturing and you couple it up with the market that India offers that you were just talking about, Anirudh. Where can the two countries do more to really harness the potential? But I also would like to get your thoughts on like-minded countries coming together, the middle power seeking agency in this hyper-digital world, AI-powered world, and their potential in building a middle power-led governance model for AI. Is that something that could be on the horizon should the right sort of complementarities, the right sort of comparative advantages come together between countries like India and Japan and others? So over to you.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great set of questions. I think very important questions. And I think questions that maybe don't get discussed in the US as much because this is really the perspective of, I think, as you've rightly framed it, the middle powers in a way, right? I think let's start with now the commonalities or the strategic convergence between India and Japan in AI. Both Japan and India, much like we've been discussing over the last some minutes, both Japan and India are worried about the same things. They're both worried about having over reliance on AI systems being built in just one or two countries. They are both worried about losing in the AI race, right? Japan coming, of course, from the perspective of being again, a very strong tech nation, right? Over the last several decades. So for them, economically, also, they don't want to lose out on the massive economic opportunity that AI represents. Similarly for India. So there's a geopolitical angle to it, there's an economic angle to it. And third, of course, there's a governance angle to it, right? So let's start with the geopolitical. I think geopolitically, there's a few pieces of AI that both Japan and India want to work on, right? One is, of course, on chips, fabs, semiconductors, the infrastructure layer, right? Japan has traditionally had strengths in certain parts of the semiconductor supply chain, but they seem to be losing some of their edge. And for them, partnerships like with India help them have that market access also and access to talent to make sure that they remain at the cutting edge of, let's say, semiconductor focused machinery that Japan has traditionally been strong on, to have an access to markets as India builds out its fabs, build out its own AI ecosystem. There's convergence there. There's convergence when it comes to energy also, right? Now, Japan has traditionally been a massive investor in India's power, roads, infrastructure sector. So, of course, I think there'll be convergence on the energy front. I think there's dependence, again, both in Japan and in India on the front of critical minerals. So, I think critical mineral mining of critical minerals is again a piece where Japan and India can work together on. India does have reserves, but of course doesn't have the mining capacity in many cases. And of course, as part of Pax Silica, India being a member now, but of course also India trying to build out its own critical energy, critical minerals infrastructure, from both being able to have the reserves, but then to be able to mine those reserves, etc. I think Japan and India will find convergence. And then of course there's defense, right? AI is increasingly now, of course, part of the latest version of wars that the world is fighting. And given that we have now seen over the last few years hot wars erupt much faster than maybe in the preceding decade or preceding decade or two, I think both Japan and India are worried about AI's use in defense and whether their capabilities in AI will be as cutting edge as their adversaries, right? So I think there will be more collaboration on the defense AI front as well, as both try to build out their military AI capabilities, right? And then the final piece, I think, is going to be talent. I think, as you pointed out, Japan, of course, has the capital, has the large corporations, has the large sort of manufacturing base. India has a lot of the tech talent that combined could really build unique capabilities. So hopefully there can be a synergy worked out there as well between Japan and India. But I would say that India's collaboration with Japan will be multi-pronged, right? And that's where I think the recent visit by the Japanese PM to India and the massive bonhomie you've seen, the warmth you've seen, and the various number of MOUs you've seen, I think portend very well for a Japan-India AI collaboration piece as well over the coming years. Now, coming to the question around governance, right? By the way, all of this will, of course, create economic opportunity for both countries as well, to my earlier point. So geopolitical compulsions combined with economic opportunity, I think, will drive India-Japan AI collaboration. But now comes the question of governance. Let me give you a conceptual framing also a little bit. In my conversation during the India AI Summit with a Japanese entrepreneur, Renito, who runs a company called Sakana AI, we discussed this at length as well. I think the conception coming out of Farwa of the US or China of where AI models are going to go is very different from how middle powers will conceive it. In the US and China, the conception is that the Americans will build out a certain set of AI models, the Chinese will build out its competitors. There'll be this almost like a rat race: who's ahead today, who's further behind by how many months, etc. And that's really the kind of conversation you hear coming out of the US and China, right? But I think in the middle powers, in the case of middle powers, there's slightly more complex or nuanced vision of where AI models are going to go. And my conversation with Ren, who had Sakana AI out of Japan, the conception we discussed is that if you were to think of AI models in a similar way as you would think of road infrastructure, then a lot of the national highways, in a way, will get built maybe by the AI companies in the US and China, the ones who have massive capital, massive talent, etc., and massive R&D capabilities. But really, it's the state highways and the local roads that might get built by the middle powers. What do we mean by that? We mean vertical models, healthcare models, domain specific models might actually get built by a Japan or an India or a France or other middle powers. So ultimately, when a user sitting anywhere in the world queries, let's say, an OpenAI or an Anthropic model on a query related to healthcare in India or Pakistan or Japan or Singapore, then ultimately that query will get directed to a domain specific healthcare model, for example, that might have been built in India using healthcare data of Indians, right? And what Ren called this was a switchboard model, right? Where now it's not that only one set of models exist in the world, but it's really a complex set of large and small domain specific models that will exist in the world. Some, of course, large models will be built in the US and China, but really a lot of the domain specific and energy efficient models might get built in countries like India and Japan and France and others. And really, ultimately, we'll have users accessing a complex ecosystem of these models, right? Now, how does this link back to governance? This all links back to governance because I think the middle powers are envisioning a much more complex multipolar AI world than I think the US and China are. Their models, their vision of models, and as a result, their vision of AI governance is very bipolar AI world driven. That it's either the US or China, pick a stack. Where I think the middle powers will envision, I would say, an AI governance model that's a lot more complex, a lot more strategically interdependent, and therefore the players on the table as well as the rules of the road are going to be very different the way the middle powers will envision it. Now, this is again very early, I would say, very early, but I think the middle powers will have a very different vision of the governance model where they will want a lot more say, but that say can only come if they bring something to the table. And I think what they can bring to the table will be some of these domain specific models and collaboration on other pieces of the AI stack, where then they will have a reason to be on the table and shape the conversation. But I think it's early days for that, so we'll see how that pans out. And hopefully, we don't live in a world where the whole set of nations around the world have to simply just pick one stack over the other, and that's the only choice of governance that they have. And hopefully, they'll have a much more multi-layered governance model that middle powers can put on the table for other countries to also pick from.
And thank you, Anirudh, for that very detailed analysis of how domain-specific outlook kind of feeds into looking at governance model that could be led by the middle powers, but also how the middle powers envisioning this whole global AI ecosystem. But also, it's very heavy on the timeline side of things, right? Like some of these ambitions are generations behind. Even if you start today, you're playing catch up. And that adds to the complexity of this whole approach. But step in the right directions, diversification, building indispensability. That's and through partnerships like India and Japan that you talked about at length. We have some work that is happening, some action that is happening to make sure that there is a position for these countries that are big markets, that have sort of sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, have the scale to be on the table where some of these important policies and decisions regarding global AI future are taking place. But I also wanted to get your thoughts on some of these other countries. You talked about the Netherlands model earlier. When you look at EU, when you look at South Korea, what is there for India to learn, whether it's from an industrial policy perspective, whether it's in terms of what domestic reforms that they have established just to make sure that they can sort of pull ahead, but also public and private sector coordination, which is another important piece. Private sector, very important stakeholder. How do you bring them into the conversation at a domestic, national level before we start discussing international level? But also, where do you think India should deliberately have a different approach than some of these countries?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. That's a great question because I think, again, as I think we've been discussing, these problems are not unique to India. And therefore, as India thinks about it, I think one of the key pieces for India to make sure it's doing is to learn from what other countries have done well or are doing well. Right. So I think that question therefore becomes very important. What you've just asked. I think there's many things for India to learn or to incorporate in its own strategy. One, industrial policy. Now, Japan and Korea, for the last several decades, as they have caught up in the industrial era, as industrial powers to the West, offer a key lesson on industrial policy to a country like India. One very important piece here, Japan and Korea countries, Korea is, of course, known for its chaebols, and Japan is also known for its large corporations. One thing for India to learn is how do you create large, globally competitive companies coming out of India without falling back into the socialist era national champions that India tried to build between 1950 and let's say 1990. Right? And I think one of the key things for India to make sure this time around, India does not fall into this trap of misallocation of resources to inefficient enterprises is to make sure that national champions, so to say, are not anointed, but that they come up through a highly competitive process. So, if, for example, India is going to have a set of companies building data centers, it should not be that India has anointed one company to build data centers, like India might have done in the socialist era, where India said for telecom, we'll have one company. Rather, I think the lesson to learn from Japan, Korea, and others in East Asia is to let a few different players compete in that space once you've decided that that's an important space, and then let the winners emerge out of a competitive process amongst those. And then you might actually help further accelerate their growth domestically as well as globally as competitive players, right? And the focus really should be on globally competitive players. I think that's one lesson. The second piece is I think India has to shed, and this is to your point about public private, India has to shed its socialist era concerns about the private sector. There is a deep rooted suspicion of the private sector in India, India's policy circles, that persists. While it's moving away from that, the pace probably is not as fast as India needs it to be. Whereas if you look at countries in East Asia, you look at Europe, you look at the US, today the collaboration between Silicon Valley and DC is, I think, mind blowing, right? Um, Similarly in Europe, similarly in East Asia, I think the public-private coordination piece, I think, is something that India will really need to learn. And for that, one of the key things India will need to do is to shed its suspicion, its inherent suspicion of the private sector and of profit making as a objective, right? Now, of course, India is different structurally as an economy, Farwa, than a Japan or a Korea. We're a much larger economy in terms of the number of people, the number of enterprises. Mid-sized enterprises are very important in India, right? And therefore, I think India's today's stock market is also a very diversified stock market. No one company, no matter how big it might be, will have the kind of dominance in the stock market mix as you might even see in the US today. So I think that diversification is very important for India. While the Japanese or the Korean conglomerate model might be a good one to learn from, India does not want to end up in a situation, in my opinion, where you just have a few conglomerates controlling the vast amounts of economic activity in India. So you want much more diversification, I think, in India of large, mid-sized, and small enterprises and startups, right? I think that's a piece where India will have to be different than, let's say, a Japan or a Korea, maybe. Third, I think that India has to learn a little bit from other countries is predictable regulation. I think India does tend to sometimes be unpredictable in its regulation. I think India needs to give predictability to both investors as well as financial investors as well as strategic investors. So I think well thought through regulation and predictable regulation and no major retrospective changes is going to be an important piece for India to learn and incorporate. And then I would say the last piece is India must attract and unlock both its domestic capital and attract foreign capital, right? India has massive domestic capital that's locked in certain, I would say, unproductive asset classes. India's got to learn how to unlock its domestic capital for its own domestic productive uses, in addition to, of course, attracting foreign capital, right? Foreign investors have lots of things to say about what they need to allocate more capital to India. That's, I think, well known. I don't have to get into it. Predictable regulation and many other pieces, I think, form part of that. But I think unlocking domestic capital to get allocated to startups, to get allocated to risk capital, to get allocated to some of the forward-looking sectors in the tech world, I think is an important piece for India to learn from countries like Netherlands, etc., in Europe, where a lot of domestic capital has gotten unlocked historically, to power their innovation. So I would say those four pieces.
And thank you, Anirudh. So there are good examples altogether, but thank you for shedding light on the private sector resistance, sort of suspicions that is very important for India to overcome, among some others, sort of industrial policy, regulatory, predictability challenges that India should try and iron out as it sort of embarks on this journey or is already on this journey. I do want to get finally a sense from you that if we were to have this conversation 5 years from now, and you look back at India's AI strategy, how would you define success? Would it be in the research, innovation, talent, sort of human capital side of things that you pointed out earlier, or is there something else like indispensability in a certain layer, building that along with other middle powers, or again individually, which that you would regard as a success in this 5 year timeline? But if you look on the flip side, what could be a potential failure?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a great question, but of course a difficult one, Farwa, as I'm sure you know, because technology, especially in this AI wave, is changing so rapidly and the competition is evolving so rapidly. While that has always been true of technology, I think historically, this time we are seeing literally players disrupt each other in the matter of months, right? What would have earlier taken years or decades to displace an incumbent, today we're seeing an Anthropic overtake OpenAI, sometimes in the matter of months. And then, some days you say Google is ahead, some days you say Microsoft is ahead, and literally third day it's a different company that sort of leaps ahead. So in an AI world where the competitive dynamics are changing so rapidly, it's a hard question to answer what you've asked. Yet I will attempt to answer it. I think if I was to narrow it down to one success factor, what I would have said will be a thing 5 years from now, if ever you and I were talking, and I'd say, yes, India has done this well, and therefore I think India is on the path to success, or at least to competitive advantage or competitiveness in the AI world, it'd be the following. It'd be for India to bridge a gap that I pointed out in my book, The Great Tech Game, as well, a few years ago, which is for India's R&D innovation ecosystem, the collaboration between industry, academia, startups, and government. These four players to be working seamlessly in a way that's throwing up innovation after innovation, whether it's in the field of AI or in the next tech wave, which we might see in a year from now, 6 months from now, or 5 years from now. That might be biotech or it might be some other space. But for India to have genuinely succeeded in the world of AI 5 years from now, the key metric for me would not be a frontier model or certain number of GPUs, etc. That actually I'm not so worried about. I think India will develop a frontier model sooner than later. India will build out its sovereign compute infrastructure sooner or later. But I think the key thing India will need to get right over the next 2 years is its innovation ecosystem and the collaboration between the four players as I defined it. I think if India is able to get that piece right, then everything else will follow. Capital will follow, risk capital will follow, great talent will want to come work in India or stay in India. If they were thinking of going abroad, they will stay in India. And then you'll really have India driven innovations coming out of this ecosystem. And you'll have India's private sector investing much more of its savings from its balance sheet into R&D. Today, India invests about 0.6, 0.7% of its GDP on R&D. That number would be much higher, I hope, in 5 years. And then you will see, I think, India having its own deep seek moments, having some parts of the AI stack where it will have build real indispensability, and then you'll have a real talent pool in India, which will say, okay, now AI wave, okay, fine, we are done, but now let's look at the next wave, let's look at the next game, and let's win at that as well, right? So that for me would be the real success metric. And to be honest, that would also, to your flip question, also be the metric for failure. If India does not over the next 5 years become that kind of product nation or that kind of innovation nation, that kind of R&D nation that we're starting to see the seeds being laid for, I would say that that'd be a big failure for a country like India, given the talent we have, given the capital we have, given the ambition India has now, right? Both in the policy circles, but also in the business circles. I think it'd be a real failure if we don't build out um, that innovation ecosystem the way we've seen many other countries build it, right? The Koreans didn't have it a few decades ago. The Israelis didn't have it. The Japanese at some point didn't have it. The Americans at some point, going back about maybe 70, 80, 100 years, didn't have it, right? So there are many examples in the world where countries have gone from being non-R&D, non-innovation driven countries to becoming what are truly tech nations. So I think India has examples to follow in that sense as well. Will be a real failure if India doesn't make that move.
And thank you very much, Anirudh. As you correctly pointed out, we are living in a very dynamic world. The news cycle is relentless, and this AI race will surely keep us all on our toes. And we will have new approaches, new policies coming up, within this 5-year timeline, but also sooner, that will shape the trajectory of most of these economies, including India. But thank you very much for your time. It was a real pleasure to be in conversation with you.
No, thank you, Farwa, for having me on, and I think for having, I think, a discussion that's, not just one country specific, but really with a broad global framing in mind, and not just a US or China framing, but really I would say, as you and I have discussed, otherwise as well, like as a middle power framing, because I think that piece will become more and more important over the coming years. So thank you for letting us have this conversation.
No, we'll get you back here for more on this. Of course, the middle powers piece is very important. Certainly this year, the terminology has taken a whole different meaning. But really appreciate your time, Anirudh. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Asia Inside Out. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Asia Society Policy Institute for making this episode possible. Thank you.